Hello, I'm James Carter, Chief Security Officer for LogRhythm and Vice President of LogRhythm Labs. Thank you for choosing to attend our presentation today on our Zero Trust journey, the successes, the failures, and hopefully dodge some pitfalls that we actually made on our journey to have you do it better than we did. So from an agenda perspective today, I'm going to provide a Zero Trust refresh. We'll talk about how we implemented our Zero Trust model. We'll look back at some of the, again, successes and failures, and then hopefully leave you some resources so that way you can start your own Zero Trust implementation. I will say that we're not going to go into a deep dive about Zero Trust. I'm just going to make an assumption that if you're attending this presentation, you understand the concepts of Zero Trust and really just focus this presentation on our journey along the way. So, what is Zero Trust? Really, it takes all the pieces of your workflow from your users to your systems, to your applications, to your data, your network traffic, system to system, applications to applications, and it breaks them all apart into separate identity perimeters or micro perimeters. I think the key here, though, is that inherently trust is not present by just having one of those micro perimeters or identity perimeters being trusted. So you have to trust all of it, but there's inherently no trust until all of the pieces fit in. It was founded by Forrester and most notably implemented by Google with their BeyondCorp model. I think whenever it was implemented and founded by Forrester, really it was a lot of concept, strategy, theory around how to actually do it. And it became a reality when Google actually implemented their BeyondCorp model. And the Google BeyondCorp model is actually the model that we followed as well loosely. And it's the most notable model that a lot of folks who are implementing Zero Trust for the first time follow as well. It's been around for a decade. I'd like to say it took a pandemic for it to become more of a reality and less of a buzzword or an aspirational goal for most. This proof point around Forrester inquiries that we confirmed with them that they've had a 3x inquiry number for Zero Trust in the last year than they had in previous years, all based on the pandemic, remote workforce, and the necessity to be more Zero Trust. So I like to jokingly call call Zero Trust the Titanic principle. There's a famous Peter Drucker quote where he says that culture will eat strategy for breakfast. And I think that's true for most large projects or engagements, but especially true when you're looking at Zero Trust. When I think of the Titanic, I think of the strategy around what they wanted to do in the architecture and the theory of being able to compartmentalize the entire bottom of a boat, the hull of the boat, in a way to where if a breach of one part of it would just flood a compartment without actually compromising the entire boat. And as we all know, the Titanic sank. So, a lot of times I look at that as the strategy being sound, but the execution may have lacked. And if you think about Zero Trust, we're really breaking all these different things into micro perimeters. And so it's the same concept where we're looking at if a attacker can compromise a user or a system or an application, they should be contained within that and not be able to spread out and cause a catastrophic breach for your business. So that's how I relate Zero Trust to the Titanic. A lot of people laugh at that just because the Titanic did sink. And I think the key takeaway here is your strategy may be sound, but it's how you execute that actually matters as it relates to Zero Trust. So our implementation of Zero Trust, it took us about 4 years. I would like to think that we could have done it a lot sooner. I think if all the stars aligned, it would have happened a lot sooner. And I think today you could actually probably go from nothing to full Zero Trust implementation in definitely less than a year. But it took us 4 years. And there's a lot of reasons why it took us 4 years. I think some of the reasons relate to the fact that the technology back in 2017 wasn't really Zero Trust enabled. It wasn't really built with Zero Trust in mind. And so you may have had these security technologies that were available at the time, but and then they would latch onto the Zero Trust buzzword and try to talk to you about how their product is the Zero Trust product. And that's just not the case. There's no real all-in-one zero trust product out there outside of what Google implemented with BeyondCorp and stuff that they developed. So really, if you're looking at how do I implement this, you're having to leverage commercially available off-the-shelf products to be able to piece together, and I kind of jokingly say Frankenstein them together, because again, if they're not built for zero trust, you're trying to make them do zero trust things with other technologies that weren't built for zero trust. It can be challenging. So when I look at 2017, even 2018, really the technology wasn't mature enough in the zero trust side to be able to do this well or easily. But you'll see here a 4-year journey, and you'll also notice in 2019 I call out a reevaluation and assessment year. Primarily, that's because we had a number of changes that occurred within our business in 2019, but also 2019 was a strong year for technology to actually be mature enough to be able to support and enable companies that want to go down the zero trust path. And so if I showed you our architecture from when we started in 2017 and what we designed late 2017, early 2018, and what we have implemented today, it's night and day. There are very few pieces that actually stayed the same throughout that entire journey. So why do we go down this path? Well, I think for us, we're probably the perfect size organization. And I think size and complexity matter as it relates to implementing zero trust. If you're a 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 employee company, you've been around for 100 years, you've got lots of legacy process intertwined with IT systems, and really having to pull all that stuff apart, being able to support both the legacy, the custom apps that your organization's developed, et cetera, and all the processes that are tied to it can be daunting, and having to unwind all of that and then basically rewind it back together. So for us, we were a smaller organization. We were around 600 employees. We have minimal legacy technology, so we're about 90% SaaS as a part of our operation, and we're a security-first company, meaning that the appetite and acceptance of security friction in the name of security and reducing of risk, corporate risk, is acceptable within our business model, because we want to set the standard as a security company of how security should be done. And so that's ingrained in our culture. And so that's what made it the perfect candidate and right fit to go down this path. How we got started is interesting. People always question this, but GDPR is how we got started. And the reason why I say that is because when GDPR came out in 2017 with enforcement in 2018, you had to take a number of activities as a part of your business. You had to map all your flows to PII data. You had to understand how users access PII data. You had to understand how systems accessed it, where it was stored, how to get rid of it. So we figured, hey, if we're already having to map this entire sort of workflow and chain together for GDPR as it relates to PII, why wouldn't we do this for our most critical business systems or critical or toxic data that if we were inadvertently disclosed, or if we had issues and experienced a breach in those particular things, or just had outages in those things that actually stop revenue generation or impact the brand of the business. And so combining GDPR with a traditional sort of business impact assessment is really where we got started with generating our requirements for zero trust. So when I look at our architecture for zero trust, this is very typical of the Google BeyondCorp model with the data plane and control plane. As you can see in the control plane here, we've inventoried. So as a part of mapping all of our users and all the workflows, et cetera, we have all the devices that are trusted. We have an inventory of all those devices, an inventory of the users that are trusted, and other attributes, whether it be on the mobile device or whatever the case is, that will infer trust. And really, these two planes work together, and they're all brokered through a access proxy or policy broker before they get allowed or denied access. And so as a user, your user has to be trusted because you have to authenticate that you are who you say you are. That authenticates off of the control plane. The device has to authenticate and also carry the attributes to infer trust for the device. Then you can actually get all the roles, permissions, and everything else for the device and the user. And then that brokers your access to what you need access to. So it's a very simple architecture at the end of the day that all can be done with commercially available off-the-shelf products. So when I look at our zero trust ecosystem, it's a number of things. I think one thing people always think of when they implement zero trust is, hey, I don't need as much on the endpoint anymore. And honestly, that couldn't be further from the truth. So, we still have an endpoint stack protecting our endpoint. We have Carbon Black and Cylance today. Talking about potentially leveraging CrowdStrike as well. We use Microsoft Intune for the MDM component for the Windows devices, and a product called Kanji for the MDM component for our Mac systems. We use Centrify for privileged access management. We are going down the path of deciding between Zscaler and Palo Alto, but likely going with Zscaler as it relates to their SASE product. Just another example of technology just now becoming ready. I think SASE was a term coined by Gartner in 2019. It wasn't around prior to when we started this. And so we originally thought we were going to have to go leverage a CASB type product to be able to do the policy brokering. But with the sort of discovery and sort of coining of SASE, we were able to leverage a product in that set to be able to pull that off. We use Okta for identity and access management. And of course, we use our Logarithm SIEM to do the UEBA components, to do the threat intel integration, to do the orchestration, automation, and response. And if you think about it from a security perspective, it's really the glue that kind of pieces this together as you interact with each of these different products to be able to protect your business. So Q2 2017, really all about identifying the data. We mapped all of our toxic data. We identified the sources. It was a part of a business impact assessment that we had conducted. We mapped everything from the users to the system to the application to the roles. We actually took apart, a lot of people said, oh, Active Directory already has a lot of this. We wanted to go clean slate and take a look at, okay, what if we didn't know anything before? Let's follow the users and what they do. Let's follow the applications and in essence, follow the data. It's almost like following the money, but you follow the data. And so with all of that, we were able to redefine roles within our systems and our company. And at the same time, as a part of this, we did the same thing with PII data. So we also helped us achieve some GDPR compliance as well. But really, if you think about it, the fundamental basis of requirements for Zero Trust is really around how you map these workflows with your employees, the systems, applications, and the data. So in Q3 2017, as I mentioned before, we had the mapping. We defined all of the roles and access rights and responsibilities for each of those roles. I'll speak to it about later, but actually this was a fundamental component of being able to optimize and create process efficiency, because I was able to actually, once I knew how roles worked and what they had access to, we were able to do things like automated provisioning and deprovisioning of users, or move ad changes where if an employee changed from one business unit to another, the role would just shift and we would automatically reprovision the right access and deprovision everything that they had rights to before. And so really it gives us a lot of clarity around what all of the workflow is within our business. And combining those two really became the basis of our model. So in Q4, if you haven't noticed, we're now 3 quarters in and we haven't implemented a thing. In Q4 2017, we actually created a business plan. We created a project plan. We created a charter. We created a budget to show the not just the cost of Zero Trust, but also the cost that you can recruit. What's the ROI that you're going to get? It's not just about reducing the current state of risk, but there's process efficiencies and there's overall cost savings as well, as you remove legacy technology and the maintenance and the licensing that you're paying for that and replacing it with technology that's more Zero Trust focused. And so when you think about this, none of this stuff existed in 2017. So we built it all from scratch. We built the business plan. We built the project plans. I built the board deck. We built the spreadsheet of the ROI and the calculations and the budget, et cetera, which, by the way, we'll provide that out to you all so you all can leverage and see what we did as a part of that. But we had to build the whole business plan from scratch. And so that took some time. And then once we built it, we had to actually go through, meet with our board, meet with our executive team to really not sell the business plan, but really just, present it in a way that made it very easy and a very easy decision for us as a security company. We're going to mitigate some risk as it relates to our security posture. We're going to save the company money. And our brand is going to be good because we're going to talk about how we did zero trust and be the example for others to follow. And so it was a win-win across the board, but we had to develop it all from scratch. So in Q1 of 2018 is when we finally did the first piece of implementation, and we really took all the users, the roles, the access rights, et cetera, and we mapped them into an identity and access management system. And so obviously I mentioned we use Okta for this, but we took all that information, all those requirements that we had, implemented in Okta. So that way within Okta, the users only had access to the tiles/applications that they were supposed to, and nothing more. And I think that's a really critical piece too. It also allowed us to actually pull away admin rights on endpoint systems. That was a sort of a byproduct of the implementation of this, as we were, really had a tight grip and understanding of what the roles were, what the users needed access to, what rights they needed, what systems and applications they needed access to. Because we had such granular level insight into that, we were able to actually remove admin rights and other things as a part of this process as well. We also did something slightly different. We actually used our HRMS, our HR management system, as our single source of truth. Oftentimes, Active Directory acts in this regard. If it's up to me, I would be rid of Active Directory as fast as humanly possible. I'm just not a big fan. I understand the technology and why it's important and why it's critical, and especially for legacy applications. But I think that identity stores in the cloud with IAM providers and things like that is really the future and the way to go now. And so we built this integration with at the time it was ADP. Was our HRMS. And we went with the assumption that if someone was collecting a paycheck from us, they were probably an employee. If they were collecting a paycheck and not an employee, then we have a completely different problem to solve. But we used that as a way to, whenever someone got promoted, someone's last name changed, someone moved from business unit to business unit, it would all get reflected in our HR system first, and then we use that as the trigger mechanism into the identity management solution to be able to actually auto provision and deprovision those based on what was in ADP. And then obviously we enabled multi-factor authentication and single sign-on. We did UEBA integration and trust inference. Trust inference is sort of a loaded term here because there is a number of pieces that can help infer trust. But we also wanted to create baselines for our users. We want to look at behaviors. We want to look at see if certain roles were attempting access to certain systems that they weren't before. Was the device approved or not? So there's a number of different sort of baselines that we wanted to set up, and so we can start looking at deviations and shifts. And deviations and shifts could mean that A, could be an attacker doing something, or B, it could be that the role is actually evolving and changing for that group or that unit or whatever the case is, and that you need to dynamically be able to adjust the policy accordingly to give them access rights. And so there's a whole aspect around here. And then obviously from a monitoring, detection, and response perspective, if a user is trusted but the device isn't, you want to be able to automate certain actions. If a device is trusted, user isn't, you want to automate some certain actions. You may force step-up authentication. You may have them answer security questions or the like. But at the end of the day, the monitoring, detection, and response component doesn't go away. The other part too is threat intel is still a valid source of information, of indicators of compromise. And you may be looking at, hey, there's an IP address. I'm looking at the network aspects of things as it relates to zero trust. That IP address shows up on a number of threat intel feeds as nefarious or associated with a certain, nation state threat actor or whatever the case might be, a ransomware variant, whatever. But really, you want to be able to, force, different actions based on that. You don't want to, even if the user's trusted and the device is trusted, if it comes in from something that's listed predominantly on a lot of threat intel, you at least want to do some validation versus just allowing it in. So, the threat intel integration piece is still important. And I think from a results perspective, when we implemented IAM, the UEBA, the trust inference, and established a lot of that, obviously you reduce security risk. You confirm user and device behaviors. That's what I meant by either they're a bad actor or a regular employee, or that their role is changing and they need different levels of access, and how you can dynamically actually update policies around that. So it made it a bit frictionless for our end user, where we didn't have to stop and manually go and adjust policies accordingly. We were able to do that dynamically based on the behaviors that we were able to witness. Microsegmentation, again, it's all about giving users, systems, and applications and data the appropriate access to the appropriate systems, applications, and data, and nothing else. So I like to use the healthcare example here, where a doctor or a nurse or some type of healthcare worker may want access to a PACS system or something that controls medical devices. However, someone that works in healthcare that sits in finance or accounting or whatever the case is probably doesn't need access to the medical device systems and medical device networks. So you want to make sure that all the your network is segmented enough from that perspective to be able to say, hey, look, here are the clusters of systems, applications, and data, and here are the cluster of users and people and roles that need access to it, and be able to create perimeters around that. And so really for us, it enabled finer grained access controls. And then also the perimeter attributes is a measure of trust. And what I mean by that is if a doctor or physician was logging onto a trusted device, their user was trusted, but now they're accessing systems they don't normally access or shouldn't be accessing. They probably shouldn't be accessing the finance and accounting systems, just like the finance and accounting folks shouldn't be accessing the medical device network. So we were able to use that behavior as a measure of trust as a part of that. So 2019, a reevaluation year. As I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, a lot of things changed. So for us, the technology matured. One thing that we did not account for as a part of our work with Zero Trust prior to 2019 was really around the custom work that was going to be required in order for us to build the appropriate integrations and have product A talk to product B in the way that we needed them to talk to each other. And so it's not something that I had actually planned. I would recommend, if you're going to go down this path, to plan still some more, a bucket of hours or time or dollar associated with some custom integrations or automations or things that you may want to build out that may not be there today. While the technology has come a long way since 2017 when we started, there are still some gaps here and there as it relates to some of these products, and there may still be a need to do some of this. Now, the great part is many of these organizations that own these products have gotten together, and they do things with like the Identity Defined Security Alliance, and where they have all the IAM providers and privileged access management providers and security companies together, and they're building integrations and they're building frameworks for this. So that way, if someone else, and the frameworks are around ZT, so if someone else wants to go do this and they have a multiple, commercially off the shelf products that they're leveraging to make Zero Trust happen, the integrations likely exist. The automations likely exist. The things that you need will likely exist. But I would still block off some time for those one-off and unique cases that may not exist. We had new owners. We got acquired by private equity. And so, it's completely different when you're, venture capital backed versus when you're private equity backed. Private equity, EBITDA is king. But I will say our private equity firm is probably the best private equity firm I've ever been around as it relates to security. They take security seriously. If I propose any changes around that or any need to be able to advance something in that space, it's 100% supported every time. And so we did get new owners, we did get new budgets and had to refactor all of that. But it really, 2019 gave us, in addition to the changes that were happening within our business, within our company, it gave us an opportunity to reevaluate things. And I think that was actually something as another lessons learned is take the time and put in time slots to reevaluate periodically, because this is when we made significant changes to our architecture. So we implemented IAM, we implemented a few of these things. Those have maintained themselves across our Zero Trust journey. but there are lots of technologies that just weren't capable then unless you force fit or Frankenstein them together. But there are a lot of them now that are actually really help you really enable zero trust. And so in 2019 was a pivotal year as it relates to that. And so we looked at it, and most of the technology that we had thought we were going to implement as a part of our zero trust model changed in 2019. So it was a really good way for us to reflect back upon that, making sure that we were using the right technology, we were saving the company money, or maximizing that from that perspective. Being able to remove legacy, on-prem firewalls, and making sure all these other pieces that we had baked into our early plan in 2017, make sure that those still held true. And there may be some consolidation that happens in the technology side where you may be able to have a single platform now doing what you originally had planned multiple platforms to do in order to achieve zero trust. And so I think because of that, it was just a great opportunity for us to reflect and reevaluate and re-architect our zero trust model. So in 2020, we started out by implementing MDM. I mentioned the couple different products that we use around that. But really, we're able to lock in on device trust, being able to apply policies. We peppered sort of the devices with certain artifacts that needed to be present for them to be considered one of our devices. There are certificates that were done. There are profiles created, system state, what applications were sitting on the endpoint. So we were able to control all of that, obviously, in addition to patch management, all the other things that we can do as it relates to that. But we were able to really leverage the MDM side in combination with what we're implementing next to be able to establish device trust and only allow access for those devices to the resources that they need. The byproduct of it also helped us clean up our BYOD problem, where people were going out to Best Buy and buying laptops and trying to connect them into our corporate network and everything else. And so as we put this stuff in, that got cleaned up as a part of it. And so we actually were able to solve some of the BYOD challenges that we had at our business through this implementation. PAM, we looked at that in 2021. So we implemented Centrify as a part of that. They're also within our Thoma Bravo portfolio. But really, once we got all the other pieces in place, we had a very small subset of privileged accounts. But I think one of the things, and we obviously wanted to control that and make sure that those were secure and only leverage whenever the time was necessary or people needed to leverage them for a certain reason to do their job. But the other thing too that I think was really interesting is, we would have multiple accounts for people to leverage based on what roles they wanted to access prior to as it relates to privileged accounts. What we're able to do is basically implement something where a user, say they're an HR employee, can log in as their normal HR person that they are and do their work. And when they log into their HR management system, they will see their data. They will see their, paychecks. They will see their benefits package. But then whenever they need to actually administer other employees, they can actually get granted the rights to be able to sort of step up into that other employees, into that other role required to be able to administer all the employees. And so we were able to even, lock down the sort of use of privileged accounts to a small number, and B, infrequently as a part of the usage, and being able to monitor and track all that as well. And then in Q2 of this year, we're making our decision on the SASE product that we'll be using to do the policy brokering and access control component of our zero trust model. Really, even though identity access management and some of these other components sort of give you some more granularity and fine-grained controls over the users and what they can access, who can access them, but there's a whole other thing, what can they do on the internet? What SaaS systems can they access, et cetera, et cetera. So it gives you even an additional level of control as it relates to users and devices. And it also, as I mentioned before, in combination with MDM, SASE helps you actually establish device trust and ensure that you can protect your systems wherever they are, no matter what location or time of day. And I think when we originally thought CASB was going to be the route, because that was the only thing that could potentially fit into this role, the great part is with the SASE implementations, you get CASB, you get DLP, you get additional security protections. And so we removed 99% of our firewalls, we end up having to maintain one small firewall just because there are a few things that we still host in a data center that we had to protect. But we were able to get rid of all the rest of our physical firewall appliances, our VPN, all the maintenance, all the costs associated with that. And we actually leveraged that to actually purchase our SASE solution that we decided to go forward with. So with that being said, it's a big thing, and it will be done in Q2 of this year. And once we complete this aspect of things, we will be complete with our Zero Trust journey. So looking back, a lot of slowdowns, as you can tell, took us 4 years. It's one thing to be the perfect sort of organization that's fit for this, another thing to take 4 years. So maybe it wasn't as perfect as we originally thought, but budgetary constraints, changes in our business, maturing of technology, being able to truly let go of some legacy technology is a part of it too. So that was sort of a battle with, I wouldn't say with our IT organization, because they're fantastic and we're amazing partners with each other. But when people that were used to firewalls being firewalls that you physically have on your perimeter and doing this, and being able to help them sort of break away from that old model of thinking was also part of it as well. But the business changes, we had to develop all the ZT sort of business components. There was all this, you could read the O'Reilly book on Zero Trust. You can read all the white papers you want about what it is. But then when it's, okay, I understand what it is. Now, how do I go do it? And I think that's the part that's still, even today, a gap in our environment. We've given use cases about how to do certain things. We've given certain materials out that may help facilitate some of that. But the business models, the project plans, the status updates, the board decks, all the stuff around the business of ZT had to be developed from scratch, and that took some time. And so hopefully we'll save you time by providing those materials to you at the end of this presentation. And then the indirect costs. I mentioned the custom integrations and automations, the workflow and processes associated with that. And so there were some indirect costs that we didn't account for as a part of our implementation. But we used 2019 to re-architect. We moved off of the legacy technology. We started realizing some of the cost savings. We started realizing some of the process efficiencies, which I think can't be understated. Is process efficiency is a huge thing in the private equity world. They want you to be lean, mean, and they want you to have these refined processes that really maximize your ability to be successful. And there is a lot of process optimization that happens as a part of a ZT implementation, and you have to factor that into the budget. I mean, that is a key component. If I can reduce IT help desk ticket load by 50% as a part of my Zero Trust implementation, well, maybe that's 50% less that they need on certain things, or they can reallocate those into other areas of the business. But that has to be factored in. And then obviously we wanted to change along with our business. One of the benefits, obviously, is it's not listed on here, but really is the COVID benefit. Whenever the pandemic hit and we forced our workforce remote, we really didn't have a hiccup in our operation whatsoever, because we were already down this Zero Trust path. When it happened, we were able to quickly pivot and really didn't have any issues associated with that, while other companies and friends of mine and other CISOs were scrambling to be able to pivot into the new remote workforce. I mentioned operational efficiency gains. We actually achieved some of those that I didn't even think that were, I didn't anticipate achieving whenever we first started the journey. One of them being the decreased IT ticket workload by doing the auto provisioning and deprovisioning, et cetera, move add changes. The recoup costs of subsidizing basically your legacy technology with your ZT technology. Whenever it all boils down, the firewall component's a great example. Will end up being more secure. Will end up being, when we go to the SASE model, will end up being have more visibility, more access, everything that we need to be able to implement Zero Trust effectively. And it'll actually come at a cost savings in comparison to the maintenance and operating expense that we were paying for our on-prem perimeter firewalls that we had in our environment. And so just that alone, for us is a 30 to 40% cost savings that we realized even more than what we originally anticipated. So obviously there's security benefits, but I think the main thing I wanted to really stress is that it's more than just security. There's operational benefits, there's IT benefits, there's a number of benefits around it, in addition to just security. And I think there's lots of benefits to the business that us as CISOs don't do a great job of presenting, but there are more than just security benefits as it relates to the implementation of Zero Trust. So I think some lessons learned real quick. You don't have to implement Zero Trust all at once. It took us 4 years, but we reaped the benefits along the way as a part of that implementation journey. Re-architecting is okay. Technology evolves, technology matures in these areas, and now everything is aligned or has alignment to Zero Trust or enables Zero Trust. And so, you will likely re-architect as a part of your implementation, and make ZT a business risk and make it a business problem and make it a business enabler. And so being able to show that you're actually making more money or reducing risk or minimizing costs associated with it is a byproduct that is important for you to stress at the board level or at the exec level. It's not just about security, risk, and technology. And then cultural alignment, and then budget ahead of time for unknown costs, which is something that we should have done a little bit better of as well. So your action plan within the next week, like I mentioned throughout the presentation, we'll be providing you access to all of our materials that we had to leverage in order to implement our Zero Trust plan, the board decks, the project plans, the budgets, and the financial models, et cetera. Leverage that, develop your roadmap, strategy, and architecture, follow the same conduct your impact assessment, identify your toxic data sources. You can follow a lot of the same paths that we did, a lot of the same activities that we went on to be able to do that. Develop your business plan, present it, get approval, hopefully, and then you're well on your way to implementing and executing. And I think, ideally, if you have a lot of these components, or we can arm you with the right materials that you can leverage to do this stuff quickly, you could realize Zero Trust in 6 months to a year. So with that, I wanted to say thank you very much for listening to my presentation on our Zero Trust journey. Hopefully you found some value in that. Feel free to reach out to me at any point in time. I'm happy to share any of the nitty gritty as it relates to the good, bad, and the ugly of our Zero Trust implementation that wasn't shared today. But overall, hopefully enjoy your rest of your conference, and thank you again.